Did you know that there's a band that had the greatest guitarists ever, and that you probably never heard about? When you think of bands with unnaturally talented guitarists, a few come to mind. Led Zeppelin, Pink Floyd. You get the idea. There are so many bands that have guitarists that are so talented you'd have a hard time finding one single band that almost unanimously tops them all and has the best guitarists. That might not be the case though. The Yardbirds are one of the most niche bands that don't seem to have gained recognition beyond several hit songs. Although the Yardbirds were a popular English rock band with several hits in the UK and that charted multiple times in the US, their only real hit this side of the Atlantic was For Your Love in 1965. So despite the fact that the band was formed in 1963 and that the band had a string of hits which included For Your Love, Heart Full of Soul, Shape of Things, and Over Under Sideways Down, the Yardbirds were still a very underrated band that didn't receive much credit or recognition at all. No recognition for their songs, though, doesn't mean that the Yardbirds were a band without credit. The Yardbirds were an influential band that started the careers of three of rock's most famous guitarists: Eric Clapton, Jimmy Page, and Jeff Beck. The Yardbirds are a band with an absolutely incredible story and an absolutely incredible legacy. And although they were originally a blues-based band, the Yardbirds broadened their range into pop and pioneering rock and contributed to many electric guitar innovations of the mid-20th century. They were so influential, in fact, that many rock critics and historians believe they had an influence on the later punk rock, progressive rock, and heavy metal trends. In 1963, the high school friends Keith Relf, Paul Samwell Smith, and Jim McCarty met another pair of high school friends, Tom Topham and Chris Drasia. They decided to start a band, just your average everyday rock and roll band. Tom Topham, however, was left with a dilemma. He could continue his art studies or he could continue with the band. It was at this time, unfortunately, that his parents intervened. They strongly disapproved of the band, so he stuck with art and left the young Yardbirds without a lead guitar player. Fortunately for the band, Topham's art school buddy was supposedly also a good guitarist. His name was Eric Clapton. So the Yardbirds met with Clapton. He joined the band, and they were off to the races. The first recordings of the band were blues, as the original group had met in a blues club and decided to be a blues band. Their third single, For Your Love, however, was one that moved away from the band's blues roots. The song, which Eric Clapton viewed as moving away from the band's original goal, didn't sit too well with him. He viewed it as lowering himself to the level of a pop band, so he quit the Yardbirds. The good news was that the band's new single was a hit. The bad news, however, was that they had to replace their most influential member. Not an easy task for any band, especially a new one. So the Yardbirds were left with one question: who would they get to replace Clapton? After asking around the London music scene, they settled on a guy named Jeff Beck. Keep in mind that this guy wasn't their first choice, but he was the best they could find with their options. He'd have to do. Just 2 days after Clapton quit the Yardbirds, Beck played his first show with the band. During Beck's time in the band, they strayed even further from their roots in blues and began forming the original sound of psychedelic rock. The band produced several hits, including Heart Full of Soul, that epitomized that sound. Since this style of music was embraced by the Beatles in their later career, the Yardbirds sometimes get the credit for being the first band to embrace this style. And since the Yardbirds were doing this style before the Beatles, does this mean that the Beatles ripped off the Yardbirds? Eventually, though, Samwell Smith quit the band to be a producer. This put them in an interesting situation. They had another vacancy that needed to be filled, but this time it was bass guitar. Drasia, the rhythm guitarist, was willing to move to bass, so they just needed to find another guitar player who could play with Jeff Beck. So who would the Yardbirds manage to find that could stand alongside Jeff Beck and elevate the band to a new level? Well, the guy who the Yardbirds found to join the band was a musician by the name of Jimmy Page. And this was the guy who recommended Jeff Beck in the first place, making it sort of an in-house ordeal. Still, the fact that Jimmy Page and Jeff Beck were in the same band was an absolutely incredible feat. These two guitar players are considered to be two of the best ever, and they were in the same band at the same time. Sadly, however, this immaculate lineup was not to last. The band only managed to record one single and a B-side with this lineup, The B-side, Psycho Daisies, is considered by many to be one of the first examples of punk rock. Soon, however, Jeff Beck decided to leave the band to move to San Francisco and be with his girlfriend at the time, Mary Hughes. This left Jimmy Page as the only guitarist in the band. He would have to carry on the legacy of the Yardbirds by himself. By around 1968, both Ralph and McCarty were bored with the genre they had inspired and led and wanted to move on to others. So they decided to pursue other projects, and the Yardbirds disbanded. And with Jimmy bored as well, and Dreja looking to do photography, it was time for the Yardbirds to come to an end. But even though the Yardbirds are no longer together, they have definitely left their mark on rock and roll and influenced some of the greatest guitarists of all time. With the Yardbirds credited for the start of the careers of both Eric Clapton and Jimmy Page, it's no wonder that the band is considered one of the most influential of all time. Add Jeff Beck to the mix, and you have a band that, although by itself may not have made as many waves as a band like Led Zeppelin, has definitely had an impact on the world of rock and roll. Speaking of Led Zeppelin though, the Yardbirds just so happened to be one of the influences for the formation of that band as well. In 1968, Jimmy Page was in need of a new project. He'd just come off of the tour for the Yardbirds' last album and was looking for something to do. That something to do, of course, ended up being the formation of the second Yardbirds, Led Zeppelin. Page had started to assemble a new lineup for the Yardbirds, but when that fell through, he decided to just start his own band. He brought Robert Plant and John Paul Jones on board, and the three of them started jamming. Plant, however, suggested that they bring in his friend John Bonham to play drums. Bonham was more than happy to join, and with that, the classic lineup of Led Zeppelin was complete. The band, of course, went on to be one of the most successful and influential rock bands of all time. They are often cited as pioneers of heavy metal, and they are definitely one of the most influential bands in rock history. And in many ways, they are the Yardbirds' legacy. Little known to those outside of the musical fields, the Yardbirds were an influential English rock band that spanned the careers of three of the greatest guitarists of all time: Eric Clapton, Jeff Beck, and Jimmy Page. They are also considered to be pioneers of psychedelic rock, and their influences can be seen in many different genres of rock, including punk rock and heavy metal. Although the Yardbirds were never a hugely successful band, they definitely made their mark on music history, and without a question left a mark on the history of guitarists. With three of the greatest of all time finding their careers from the Yardbirds, you can see how this band has definitely cemented their place in rock history, and how they have had an undeniable impact on music as a whole. That's it for this video though. Let us know your thoughts about the Yardbirds in the comments below, and we'll see you in the next one.